With all of the success in the hobby space for Battletech, truly starting with the Game of Armored Combat box, and leading into the two incredibly successful Kickstarters for the Clan Invasion and Mercenaries, one would be surprised to discover that there is a source for this revitalization that extends past just the tabletop itself. This is a piece which I have put together, based on my own experiences, and based on what I've seen over the years regarding the franchise itself. In other words, this is an opinion piece from an outsider looking in. I went through to cross-reference dates and sales totals just to let you all know to make sure that these things should line up with the overall piece. It is the conclusion that I have come to based off of the series of events that have happened, that have unfurled over the years. So we are headed to the decline of everything first, because in this presentation, I am also going to take you through to Battletech's grand revival, which happened because of the digital version of this IP, breathing life, interest, and creativity back into it. We are going to talk about how Mechwarrior saved Battletech. Battletech had a great run, really starting in the mid-80s. Let's do a bit of an overview of how things ended up having issues, though. FASA had great successes with a series of products, including, of course, Battletech. But the cracks were already starting to show by this time. Part of it, as you would probably suspect, was mismanagement. Other parts were grievous errors of a variety of sorts. But inevitably, it was legal troubles that really hampered FASA. It's not a subject I bring up very often, as the fans of the setting are hypersensitive to it, and can't seem to move on from it now that it's been functionally over for years. But yes, the slide for Battletech during its boom time in the late 80s and early 90s started with the Harmony Gold lawsuit. Many miniatures and sourcebooks had to be removed or changed dramatically in order to fit in line with the new restrictions which FASA found itself shackled with. These restrictions would impact the franchise for over 20 years after they initially took place. Though, this appears to have started with a dispute between Playmates and FASA. FASA would allege that Playmates had in fact infringed upon them, though they would not come out victorious in their coming lawsuit. Unfortunately for FASA itself, it would appear that this lawsuit opened the doors for more litigation on other fronts. The exact details around all of this could take hours to discuss, but at the end of the day, the property suffered, and suffered greatly. As you can probably all guess, in the 1980s, at the very beginning of where Battletech started, FASA had mirrored many popular aspects of the settings it had licensed from, such as land air mechs, and the use of very popular designs like the Marauder and Warhammer. With these exiting the scene, it created a real problem for FASA, as they tried to find other mechs to fill the void, and to keep interest in the intellectual property that they had built. More than ironically, Mechwarrior 2 appeared during all of this, as well as Mechwarriors 3 and 4, which did indeed at the time give a boost to FASA. But mismanagement happened on this front as well, as the gaming rights and division were sold to Microsoft, creating the issue that it no longer made revenue for FASA as a company, which of course caused even more problems. Another issue to point out with all of this is they lost control. From this point forward, games would only be made if Microsoft wanted to make them, which meant that the advertising that went along with distributing video games more or less would begin to dry up if no games were being made. Inevitably, things started to become too much, and FASA would close its doors. And Jordan Weisman, one of the founders of FASA, would start WizKids, and he brought the Battletech license along with him. WizKids would go on to create a game which, though it may have many new adopters, left most of the previous Battletech audience behind. The Mechwarrior Dark Age Clicks game was definitely of its time, we shall say. In the early 2000s, at that moment in history, They basically burned most of the lore to the ground in order to accommodate a new setting for the Inner Sphere, a new start, if you will. This, as you can probably guess, became repulsive to a huge portion, if not the overwhelming majority, of the traditional fans. The new fans as well appeared to be more fleeting in their love of the game, and over the course of their tenure managing the property, Mechwarrior Dark Age, and its successor run-up game Mechwarrior Age of Destruction, withered away. The rift caused by this, to be clear, has yet to recover. The Blakest Era and Dark Age are literally no-go zones for an enormous amount of the fanbase. And even among new fans, most tend to stay in the Succession Wars, Clan Invasion, and to a lesser extent, the FedCom Civil War. There was still classic Battletech at this time, which was operated and run by a company named FanPro, but it was more often than not poorly supported, and didn't always coordinate appropriately with WizKids either. Several projects were launched to try to entice people to follow the setting, such as Battlecore, and a reimagining and relaunching of some of the classic technical readouts. But this venture was always quite hollow. FanPro would have a mixed tenure while managing the license, and was never able to really keep it satiated or in check. During all of these interesting decisions and mismanagement, Microsoft, who had released Mech Commander 2 and Mechwarrior 4, two major titles which did inject some new blood into the tabletop market through exposure, would release the Mech Assault franchise. Mech Assault, much like Dark Age, appealed to many new fans with less exposure to Battletech, but struggled to win over the old crowd. From a lore perspective, these games actually had more in common with gibberish than the core franchise, but they could be fun to play, in theory. It turns out, however, they weren't as fun to play as Halo, and Microsoft wound down the series after its second entry, which by this point was a title only vaguely related to the Battletech license through the names of the factions and mechs, more so than anything in-universe in terms of how it looked, worked, or even how the stories were told and what they were told about. With the death of Mech Assault and its rocky handling, this created a dead zone for Battletech in the media space, further reducing adoption to both Dark Age, while it was still being supported, and classic Battletech. This period of time in the early to mid-2000s would be frankly the lowest point in the entirety of the history of the setting. For many, this was truly the end, in fact. The intellectual property seemed to be set to vanish, if slowly, even though it still had fans. Online communities and local tabletop communities tried to keep the lights on. Game mods like Mechwarrior Living Legends also played their part, and let's not even forget about the Megamech communities at the time. But much of the energy behind the product was gone, because there was nothing big being put into play or things being given out at high quality. Catalyst Game Labs would emerge in all of this, started by Lauren Coleman, a writer of the franchise, who would take over the role that FanPro once had, though now this new company would be able to manage the Dark Age. Still, they appeared to be overlooking the remnants of a diminished Colossus as they entered the scene in 2007. However, this one-time juggernaut of the gaming industry looked more to be a shambling zombie or a half-constructed Frankenmech, rather than what it had been in its days of glory in the late 80s through to the mid-90s. Mech Assault 2 launched in 2004, and for 5 years, there was total silence on anything related to Mechwarrior, as the tabletop side of things also suffered dramatically. So, everything, digitally, remained dormant, as Microsoft did nothing further with the product. FASA Interactive simply disappeared. In 2009, though, a company named Smith & Tinker, which was founded by Jordan Weisman, would partner with Piranha Games Incorporated in order to attempt to raise interest in a Mechwarrior game, which would have been published for the Xbox and PC, due to restrictions with the license at the time preventing it from appearing on a Sony platform like PlayStation. A large, detailed trailer would be released, and it would be named simply Mechwarrior, but it would be the 5th iteration of this classic series, if it got off the ground. Clearly, this new installation was going to bring new graphics and gameplay to the series, which hadn't been touched for several generations, at least as far as consoles were concerned. Things seemed to be on the cusp of something grand, but this was done before securing everything needed to build such a game. This original Mechwarrior 5 simply couldn't get off the ground. The franchise had been inert for too long, for starters. I am sure also that the lack of interest in MechAssault didn't exactly give confidence to investors either. Without a guaranteed Sony release, no one seemed willing to jump on board, at least not in its current form. A tragedy, a failed game, was now all that remained of this attempt. Once more, the setting seemed prepared to head down the road of disappointment. Smith & Tinker backed away from the Mechwarrior license due to the failure to find funding for the game. But the licensing for Mechwarrior would be solely leased by Piranha Games, who would opt to go it alone, creating a new Mechwarrior game all by themselves, albeit a different variation of it. They sought to crowdfund this new game, and it was designed on a free-to-play model, mirroring World of Tanks. This game, of course, as many in the audience will know, is Mechwarrior Online. Now, before anyone responds too negatively at certain things that have happened in the history of Mechwarrior Online, there are a series of vital and important things MWO did, because it is from this point that the revival of Battletech began. This new game, which was a PvP multiplayer game, needed new assets. Battletech's art had been mostly left untouched for many classical designs. Alex Iglesias, or Flying Debris as he's more frequently known online, would be the principal designer for this platform, and would determine the art direction for not only Mechwarrior Online, but for the later titles of Mechwarrior 5 and another extremely important title, a tactical game named Battletech, but we'll touch more on that later. These new high-quality, standardized designs were immediately catching to the eye, and raised the bar for the art direction for Battletech to a level it had never been elevated to before. Something that's important to note is that the art is often the driving force behind the property, even more so than gameplay or storylines. These are two components that are extremely important as well, but visual imagery is indeed the most powerful element behind if someone is going to get into a property at all. MWO collected $5 million with its founder's crowdfunding campaign, something which, full disclosure, I purchased into as well. At the time, this was exceptional and showed there was indeed enough interest in the property to deliver something for players. In October 2012, the beta for the game launched, and it officially came online in September of 2013. This game, for all its faults and nuances, finally brought attention back to the property, and when combined with its superb art style, this was a major injection of energy into this once stilled, half-cored salvage piece that was Battletech at the time. Over the coming years, many players of this game would begin to either rekindle their interest in the tabletop, or it opened up opportunities for new people now engaging with this fictional world to become interested in the game beyond Mechwarrior Online. These are all small, important seeds. Positive exposure in almost any form is like fire spreading through dry wood regarding merchandise related to any fandom, but especially with things like tabletop games. For instance, the Dawn of War game truly put a rocket under Warhammer 40,000, just as an example. Or even you can look towards Mechwarrior 2 and its influence on the fanbase of Battletech on which factions you will enjoy or not enjoy. Now, MWO did have its ups and downs. but it would also spawn 2 additional products which further exposed the game, and these were only made possible because of the development of MWO by Piranha Games. The most significant of these 2 was the return of Jordan Weisman once more to the franchise, this time through another company he formed, called Harebrained Schemes. To quickly cover this other company, HBS, after it appeared, created 3 absolutely fantastic and successful Shadowrun games. Shadowrun is a role-playing game I may also want to cover on this channel at some point, which was also created by FASA. Mr. Weisman, however, wasn't finished with his involvement with Battletech either, and while he was no longer the one licensing directly from Microsoft, there was still a connection enough to get things moving. Seemingly following the crowdfunding model of MWO, HBS would make a pitch to create a new, turn-based tactical game in the universe which Jordan had created decades prior, working with PGI, gaining a sub-license from them, and using their art and mecha assets. HBS would put together a beautiful vision for gamers to indulge in. The company, as a result of this, would raise $2.7 million in their initial crowdfunding efforts, and would end up delivering one of the most beloved games in the franchise's history in 2018. The atmosphere, environment, battle mechs, and everything landed perfectly. The game had an exceptional reception, and prior to its launch, HBS was acquired by Paradox Interactive. It was more than a success, and if I'm honest, at this point, there was an enormous amount of energy around the franchise. There were even hopes, wishes, and calls for some form of update to the tabletop game, especially given how HBS Battletech emulated it. It would have 3 successful DLCs before the game would wind down support. Despite being financially successful, Paradox wanted to move in the direction of working with IPs it controlled, rather than ones it licensed, at least for its core studios. While this is a tragedy, HBS's Battletech is still an incredible game, and one which has an unquestionably important place in the history of the franchise. It is so popular that House Arano, the periphery state invented for the game, might just be one of the most popular factions, and it taking place in the periphery elevated the periphery to a level in terms of popularity which it has never been at before. Mechwarrior 5 Mercenaries 2 would launch, though its release was a bit more controversial, for a multitude of reasons. The game released in a less than complete state, and unfortunately also had a series of poor designs and product decisions built into it, at least at first. Some of this was because PGI had been struggling to a degree in the years up until the release. MWO had seemingly started to taper off, and there was limited to no support outside of what PGI itself could claw together. While it does have its detractors, and nothing is beyond criticism, it is important to note that until PGI was acquired by a NAD7 Global, a growing Swedish game publisher, they were always self-publishing MWO and everything else they did. Businesses without major investment and support from outside are always very much hand-to-mouth, and some of the issues with Mechwarrior 5 and MWO can really be laid at the feet of this condition. All the same, Mechwarrior 5, as it has matured, has turned into a much beloved game as well. MWO in recent times has improved greatly, and has seen a small resurgence as well. These two have coincided with interest in the tabletop game, and vice versa at this point. An immensely important event took place during all of this though. Harmony Gold in 2017 would launch a lawsuit against Catalyst Game Labs, Harebrained Schemes, and Piranha Games in order to restrict their usage of their wildly redesigned Unseen mechs. What is most fascinating is Harmony Gold made the claim that the Atlas infringed on their copyright, despite the fact that it was the face of Battletech and an original design used by FASA since the 1980s. Other details in what can only be described as a flawed case resulted in the entity which was most hated by Battletech fans for decades being forced to withdraw their claims from court, and worse, being dismissed with prejudice by the presiding judge. This was another major victory for the intellectual property, for the franchise. And it was waged mostly by Piranha Games, which I have to stress. And this liberated both HBS and CGL from the shackles that restricted them. Regardless of whatever you feel about Mechwarrior Online or Mechwarrior 5, which to be clear are two products I have enjoyed, it is impossible to overlook this, and just how important it is. PGI, in essence, ended the longest-running hindrance the franchise had ever faced, and created opportunities for Battletech because of it. With all of this having happened, in 2019, with all of the energy, talk, and enthusiasm in the franchise, Catalyst Game Labs, the licensee for the tabletop game and storylines of Battletech, would themselves, in essence, relaunch the game. All of this can be traced back to the decision in 2009 by Jordan Weisman and other people at Smith and Tinker to try to resurrect Mechwarrior. From there, it can be traced over to Russ Bullock and Piranha Games, stubbornly pressing ahead with the property, and only with minimum support outside of the community. Catalyst Game Labs never exactly abandoned Battletech, though there were missteps and stumbles that the company made along the way to its major victories in the tabletop gaming space. The company would attempt to flesh out the Dark Age and Blakist eras in the 2000s and 2010s as they acquired the ability to publish about the Dark Age, the setting of the defunct Clicks game. They would publish new TROs, and even made some new designs for these times in their 3145 series of books. These new mechs and vehicles were sharp, and superb really, with some even being done by flying debris, like the Gwyn or Lu Hui Bing. Probably the most noteworthy were the Celestial series of battle mechs, though truth be told, outside of the ghostly remnant of the fanbase, these mechs would receive minimum exposure for a very long time. The other problem for CGL is for miniatures, where they would be dependent on Ironwind Metals, which is a great manufacturer of battle mechs, I should be clear, and should you need any of their excellent sculpts, I recommend checking them out. The problem was more so that Ironwind Metals are more expensive than plastics, by a fairly large margin, and most of these sculpts at the time were quite dated. Catalyst, in an attempt to get the franchise back out there themselves too, in 2007 would release a box filled with very poor plastic miniatures. This particular product was the Battletech Introductory Box Set. The reception to the rules of Battletech were good at the time, with this slightly tweaked and refined rule set largely being celebrated by wargame enthusiasts at the time. The box, however, despite having great value due to the volume of miniatures within, was not. An update to the introductory box set would be done in 2014, with similar miniatures. The real holdback each time appears to have been the models, at least in my view. While they did improve in quality over time between releases, the sculpts were old, many of them literally from the 1980s. Regardless of what one wants to say about Games Workshop, they had over the 2000s and 2010s raised the bar in terms of tabletop wargames in regards to miniature quality. Other games like Infinity should also be mentioned too, as they had been also raising their quality. This meant that modern tabletop gamers, fundamentally, don't play games with poor quality art, and especially with lower quality models. CGL would also make some mistakes, with talent even, during the early 2010s as well. All of this meant that Catalyst, in many ways, up until this time, was in a very rough spot while operating in tabletop spaces. They republished novels, books, and rules for the game from the 80s and 90s, of course. They created new fiction for the setting as well, but the newer fiction didn't always have the same audience it once did. Their attempts to impact the tabletop space was met with difficulties due to the miniatures and art direction of the time, and this inevitably led to having a more difficult time influencing retail spaces, thus once more creating problems just getting the game out there. But in 2019, shortly after the release of HPS Battletech, and years after the release of MWO, taking on a new art direction and reimagining the setting very much in the same way Piranha Games did, though obviously with their own unique art direction as to differ it from Microsoft's portion of the license, Battletech would release the Game of Armored Combat starter box, and the box came with high-quality new miniatures. The box itself would be a success, and the same year, the Clan Invasion Kickstarter raised $2.5 million during its initial opening, and over $5 million with its extended campaign. This campaign was to release a series of high-quality minis as well, and in a new form of release for the company. These models came packaged in a way that would allow retailers to more easily carry the product, which is exceptionally important. Often, Kickstarters end up as a one-and-done for many tabletop games, but Battletech also showed itself to have legs at retail, where it sold extremely well. The community around the tabletop game was revived by these two events, following in the wake of what Piranha Games and HPS had achieved in the online and digital gaming spaces. Make no mistake, none of these things would have been possible had it not been for an attempt to first resurrect Mechwarrior in 2009. Since the first Kickstarter too, Catalyst has made regular releases, which have done well, at least from what we can tell. Its late Dark Age materials and their new Ill-Clan era have also seen at the very least much more success than anything that they were releasing prior to the Clan Invasion campaign. This is legitimately due to the hard work of the team that is there, both in the form of those who work on the written rules and storylines, in both rulebook and novel form, and just as, if not more importantly, because of the artists who have been assembled to create new stunning pictures and superb BattleMech redesigns and designs. In other words, Ray Arista, the line developer during all of this, has played an enormous role in the rekindling of the franchise, and a huge amount of work of he and his cohorts, because remember, no one is an island, have played a huge role in keeping the success of the franchise moving. Anthony Scroggins and the genuine multitudes of talented artists who have worked on redesigning the BattleMechs in the franchise, as well as creating fantastic art pieces for it, should also be recognized for their hugely important role in all of this as well. The Mercenaries Kickstarter, which has just concluded, has raised over $7.5 million due to its initial opening, and it has around 24,000 backers. It is also one of the biggest successes in the history of the website, as far as miniatures and tabletop games are concerned. This tabletop game, which will not receive the same widespread appeal as a video game, represents the massive growth the game has undergone since the launching of MWO. What was once a defunct franchise is once more one of the most important components of the tabletop gaming space, and is, with a bit of luck, going to continue to thrive digitally as well. It is a good time to be a fan of Battletech, isn't it? So there you have it. While I don't have every detail of the adventure here, regarding the most specific and precise components of everything, or all of the people involved at various steps, I did my best to cover what I could. There are also some events that are locked behind sealed documents, which can't really be known by anyone at least for a long time, and the community would be dependent on hearsay to get any meaningful explanation for what could be inside of them. I don't think any materials regarding hearsay entered this video, as I did do my best to go over things without speculating, or knowingly reiterating speculations. Overall, I really do believe that if it were not for Jordan Weisman in 2009 trying to bring Mechwarrior back to life, the franchise would have never recovered. Ever. I sincerely believe that too. I don't think that Battletech would be anything more than it was 10 years ago. Its art clearly influenced so much of what's happened, but it's also boosted the awareness of the property around the world, to the point where people once more took interest in this old guard of the tabletop and role-playing world. It also has to be said, because I know there can be some negativity about PGI for various reasons. And I was there, for instance, when they attempted to cash in on the Star Citizen craze with the Transverse. Oh boy. But regardless, Piranha Games is the most important point in this entire equation. If it wasn't for their work, if it wasn't for them moving ahead with MWO when Mechwarrior 5 fell apart originally, if it wasn't for the artwork they'd produced, i.e. the work by Flying Debris, or their general promotions of the product, I can't imagine where Battletech would be right now. It is through PGI that Mechwarrior finally appeared in a game property after the debacle that Mechassault had left behind. It is because of PGI that Battletech, by harebrained schemes, was made, just due to assets alone, which is another enormous contributor to the success we've seen for the setting. And it is because of PGI that Mechwarrior 5 moved forward at all, despite it being on a rocky path. There are, and were, no other developers of any pedigree waiting in the wings to jump on this property, barring some recent words by Phil Spencer potentially wanting Microsoft to revisit Mechassault, which frankly makes me nervous given the last two outings. Third-person action Mechwarrior isn't inherently a bad idea, but Mechassault was not a great step for the setting, and the fate of that part of the franchise alone should be explanation enough as to why. I may not be feeling irrational, but I am feeling confrontational. And so, I'm going to tell all of you now that Mechassault did not get away with murdering the franchise for over a decade. So, at this point, I'm going to do something here, in public, which I think should be done, and should be acknowledged. On behalf of only myself, because I can only speak for myself, I want to thank a series of people and organizations of people who were central in making all of this return possible. While some things may have happened for Battletech in its various forms without them, it would have never returned the way it had, without their involvement. And we can only credit those who were actually engaged and involved with what happened, rather than wish listing for what we wished would have happened. First, I want to thank Jordan Weisman and people who worked at Smith & Tinker at the time for their bold attempt to make Mechwarrior 5 happen in the late 2000s, 4 or 5 years after Mechassault had been released by Microsoft. This was the catalyst for everything that has happened afterwards, and credit must be given to them. Next, I would like to thank Russ Bullock, as well as Flying Debris, and all of the staff and producers at Piranha Games Incorporated over the years, for pushing forward throughout the difficulties of running a game company independently for so long, as well as for finding ways to keep the setting relevant, all while delivering at various times solid game experiences. Mechwarrior Online was a lifeline for the IP, and the genesis for so much more, with HBS's Battletech and Mechwarrior 5 directly being the result of their efforts as well. It'd also be impossible, of course, not to thank Mitch Geitelman, who is a co-founder with Jordan Weisman for Harebrained Schemes, as well as the entirety of the staff who worked on making HBS's Battletech. This game, I think, is the best representation of Battletech in media to date, and it has had an impact well beyond its gameplay as a result. Of course, Mechwarrior being the major motivator for the revival of this beloved tabletop game and world does not negate the incredible hard work and difficulties faced by the great people at Catalyst Game Labs. I say this and I mean it, a lot of the time being a game developer for either tabletop or video games can feel like a thankless job. For instance, I can even be harsh in my reviews of certain products, but all the same, it'd be impossible to not recognize their hard work, effort, and the improvements Catalyst have not only made to Battletech, but to their organization as they have ran with the success of the Clan Invasion Kickstarter, and now with the success of the Mercenaries Kickstarter. I just want to make clear that these compliments can also be applied to PGI and Harebrained Schemes as well. It really does feel like only the beginning of good times, even if I grumble from time to time. So with that, I would like to give a huge thank you to Lauren Coleman, Randall Bills, Ray Arista, Anthony Scroggins, John Helfers, Brent Evans, and literally everyone who works both directly for CGL or is currently a freelancer who creates content for them as well. It is no understatement to say that much of what is happening right now for the game and franchise is happening because of all of you. I'd try to list every single person, but it would be nearly an impossible feat. Really, everyone from PGI, CGL, and HBS. You all have my thanks for doing what you've done to bring this world back to life. Things have been touch and go for decades, but it finally feels like there is real stability and a real future for Battletech. The 31st and 32nd centuries have never felt so bright, despite how dour they can be. Thank you all for joining me here today. First things first, I'd like to remind people, if you enjoy this content, don't forget to hit the like button and don't forget to check if you're subscribed. I do release content very frequently, not always opinion-based like this particular piece, but I have great reviews on BattleMechs and an assortment of other things relating to Battletech. You'll want to check them out. I'm pretty sure I didn't make any mistakes in terms of the facts I talked about in this video, but it's always possible. Forgive me if anything like that comes up. A lot of this, of course, was mostly just my opinion-based content. If I got some numbers wrong here or there, or I misplaced where an event might be, forgive me. Also, I would like to thank all of the YouTube channel members for this channel. What I do here would literally not be possible were it not for you guys. Quite seriously, this is only made possible because of viewers like you. If you would also like to support the channel in the way that these members do, you can hit the join button, which you will see on YouTube, which will, of course, allow you to potentially contribute as a channel member. And finally, if you agree with my points here and you think that these people are worthy of our thanks as gamers and people who appreciate Battletech, let me know in the comment section below. And maybe even let these people know in some way on like a social media platform. They're pretty awesome. If you disagree with me, that is also entirely okay, because either way, I will catch you in the comment section below.